today. The developers from Asymmetric Games who produced our Game of the Month this month, West of Loathing, Zach, I don't know your last name, Kevin, I also don't know your last name. So, with that, I'm going to open the floor to anyone who has any questions for our guest developers. Just raise your hand, and if not, I'm going to grab a question. I guess I'll start it off. So, Kingdom of West of Loathing was your second project. When you originally started the Kingdom of Loathing, what did you take away from Kingdom of Loathing that helped you develop this sequel?
Okay, so I guess the basic story of the company is that in 2003, I just by myself made a sort of a goofy stick figure web game. I was a database programmer, IT guy professionally, and I just kind of used that stuff nights and weekends to make this thing. And so took off, built the company around that, and we've been continuing to add content to it and maintain it and work on it for all the years since then. And West of Loathing is like a single player game that's set in the same universe. It's got the same art style, same writing style. Same artist, which is me, and the same writers, which is me and another guy. What did we learn from Kingdom of Loathing?
So Kingdom of Loathing is an ongoing project. It's an MMO, and so it is always going to need attention, and it's always going to need things like forward momentum and forward development. We wanted a project that we could at least eventually put out into the world and be done with, and not have to support for the rest of our lives. So that was one thing that we were sort of striving for.
Yeah, I guess from Kingdom of Loathing we learned don't do that again.
Yeah. try to have actual physical like products that you can ship, and then eventually you support them for a while, but then they are done and they're out in the world, instead of just sort of areas of responsibility that you have to sort of keep thinking about forever. Because that's, after 14 years of working on the same project, you eventually think maybe it's not the best thing to do is to always be sort of stuck in one Kingdom of Loathing was sort of broader in the sense that it was kind of every genre at once. We didn't ever feel tied to a particular thing, and we narrowed our focus for West of Loathing to the Wild West. And I think sort of a particular time and place to make the game, making it our own with with magic and goblins still or whatever, but trying to sort of have a more focused, sort of smaller scope was also something that we tried to do.
Yeah, I think constraints are definitely your friend. Video games are always going to get out of hand. You're always going to have more ideas than you have time for. Really, you're always going to have more ideas than you have good ideas. But especially, you're going to have more ideas than time. And so, having something that's slightly constrained, even just picking a genre, just a narrative genre, and having to stick to that was really valuable for us. One thing that was super nice about Kingdom of Loathing, it was a hassle in the moment. Looking back, it was obviously nice, was constantly having very short-term deadlines. We had to have a thing out by Christmas so that the Christmas event would happen. We had to have a thing out by Halloween. We had to have the next thing that we were selling this month had to be out at a specific time. And so we were accustomed to being forced to create the kind of content that we make very, very quickly. And so we built West of Loathing to support our workflow rather than adjusting our workflow to try to make a product. And so we were basically in the habit of just making this stuff very, very fast. And so we were able to, in just a couple of years, make what turned out to be a really surprisingly large game for what it looks like. It's kind of, generally I think, the fact that what the game looks like sets expectations pretty low is good for us, because it ends up being a thing that really surprises people when they realize, oh, they actually paid attention to this. There is actually a lot to do, and there's a lot going on here. And so yeah, I think spending a long time working on Kingdom of Loathing let us just sort of understand what we were good at, and taught us how to kind of play to those strengths institutionally to produce the best product we could with a relatively small amount of time and budget.
Anything else? Otherwise, I can So, there are hundreds of items in West of Loathing, and also Kingdom of Loathing, including styles and all that. How do you balance all of that? You did that?
So that's a great question. So West of Loathing is a lot easier because it is a finite scope sort of situation where we know where you're starting from and where you're going to end up. And there's a spectrum there of experiences that we expect you to have, and it's open world, so it's not necessarily happening in a prescribed order. But we have a general sense of progression from the starting point to the end point, and you're going to travel some sort of meandering path through there. And so we can sort of set a bunch of numbers for like the stats of the monsters you're going to encounter and what would make sense for a character to have in terms of their sort of character stats plus the modifiers that come from equipment or whatever. Whereas in Kingdom of Loathing, there's a couple things working against us in that space. There's the fact that the game's been around for over a decade. So just in terms of like real human time, people want to feel like things like they're getting things that are more powerful over time. So this is the problem that World of Warcraft has had since very early on with sort of the expansion of numbers, right? They actually like did a scaling back of numbers just because things were getting like exponentially out of control for them. Our game also has a sort of a weird mechanic where you play through the game's content and then you sort of restart with a character at level 1 you get to keep a little bit of power from your initial incarnation. And so you're playing through the same content over and over and over again, starting from low level to all the way to the end game. And so having sort of itemization in that space is tricky because we have like gear that you can only equip at a certain sort of stat level, but then because of like the fact that we've made like donation items that we want anybody who gives us money to be able to play, those things don't have those same constraints, so you can equip them at any level basically, and so those need to be sort of balanced in the sense that you can use them at level 1 and also at level 15 and still have some sort of like sense that they're appropriate for what you're doing.
We eventually moved to a similar model to what like Magic the Gathering or Hearthstone does, where for competitive play of Kingdom of Loathing, at least like the leaderboard stuff, you can only use items that are like less than 3 years old. So that's one way of us sort of correcting the mistakes that we made in the past. It was another really nice thing about making West of Loathing was like we had 15 years of screwing up Kingdom of Loathing to teach us what not to do with this, and also way less pressure because like Kevin said, it's a single player game. It's like, it's probably fine in like Skyrim if you find a sword and then that's the best sword you have for the rest of the game because it's a few hours, you're done. You obviously try to make it so that you can give people the most little like exciting boosts that you can, but it's also just like it's easier when you don't have to balance for competitive.
We definitely tuned West of Loathing to be relatively easy. We wanted it to be incredibly accessible to players even sort of a novice skill level, and the most complaints that we got was that the game was too easy. And I think we were okay with that because we would rather have people able to play through the game and see a bunch of jokes than getting stuck and sort of quitting the game in frustration.
And there's an optional hard mode that you can play, and that's where we spent a little bit more time trying to make combat challenging. Also, I mean, the combat is definitely like the weakest part of the game. I think it's that we during the entirety of development, we kept saying, all right, like. The second half of development, we're going to just spend making all the combat good, and then the last quarter of development, we're going to make combat good. Okay, the last 10% of our development time is just going to be making combat good, and then the game came out, and we were like, crap. But it ended up fine. I mean, we just ended up more and more just erring on the side of making it easy, because that's kind of, the game also revealed itself to not really be about that. Like, it turned into way more of an adventure game than we thought we were making, which is fine, It's the project at a certain point is going to sort of tell you what it is, and you're probably better off listening to it than like sticking to your guns and making a bad version of whatever you were setting out to make.
We had a lot of discussions during development about, do we just cut combat entirely? Like, we had, originally envisioned this as a full-blown RPG with a bunch of itemization, a bunch of combat and stuff like that, and we would show the game to people, and they were really digging the game kind of in its adventure game prologue, and would we be okay with cutting combat? And we decided not to do so in part because we wanted there to be the joy of opening a crate and finding a cool sword in there, and what are you going to use that sword if you don't have combat? Like what is going to be the purpose of all of this itemization if there isn't some sort of system into which you use it? And I think it was definitely worth discussing, and I'm glad that we talked about it, but I think it's sticking with our original plan of keeping it a role-playing game with sort of these systematized combats and like gearing and skills and stuff like that. It ended up working out fine, and it's a thing that I think we can iterate on in the future in later games, and even just in downloadable content for the game that we're making still, because we're still adding content to West of Loathing, and thinking about like how to make combat more interesting in that way, sort of.
Especially with all the, now that like tens of thousands of people have played it
Yeah.
and posted on the Steam forums about stuff they liked and stuff they didn't like, we have a better sense of like what kind of broadly worked and what didn't, and so that's nice information to have if you can get it.
Quick question, is that what the Desolate Lonely Coast is for?
Yeah, that's just there for if we decide to do some DLC that's actually a bunch of new map locations there. Yeah.
Okay. So the beginning of West of Loathing, there was an article about this. I thought it was interesting. You only really pick two things: your gender and then your class, and also status like cost of money. But the rest of that is sort of just, it more or less happens naturally. How did you go about designing that?
It was pretty important to us to not like explicitly have a tutorial. And so we wanted to make it so like you just I kind of don't like in a game where it tells you to do a thing and all of the UI elements that aren't that thing are grayed out and you just have to just sit there and do what it says. Like you get enough doing what other people tell you to do in your normal life, right? So the idea that the game could just teach you how to play it by allowing you to play it was a thing that was very, very appealing to us. And over the course of the prologue of West of Loathing, you're making some decisions about what the rest of the game is going to be like. You're choosing a partner to take with you. You're choosing a horse to buy, and the horse determines kind of the sorts of random encounters that you get later in the game once you finish the prologue, and the partner determines like they're all different in combat, and they give you some different options for dealing with quests, and they'll unlock different. They don't unlock like exclusive areas, but they will. Like if you take Doc Alice, you're gonna always find the graveyard every time you go to a new place, and if you take Susie, you're always gonna find the ranch the next time you go to a new place. But we didn't want that to just be like a menu that you picked stuff from when you were creating your character, right? We wanted you to start playing the game right away, and so it was really like initially the part of the game that takes place on the farm wasn't there to begin with. It was from like. It started out and there was just like a paragraph of text that was like, hey, you should pick a class. Here's what the different classes do. Which one do you want to be? And people just universally just pounded on the button to skip through it and weren't paying attention to it. So okay, you can't, before you've even like, before you have shown a person anything about what your game is, you cannot ask them to do a bunch of reading because no one will do it. Even if it is, like West of Loathing, a game that is in large part about reading, you still have to kind of ease people into it and say, all right, well, this is why the reading is worth it, because we've given you a little bit here and a little bit there, but then we actually let you move a dude around on a screen and do some fun stuff in the world and like have an effect on things and make some decisions about stuff. So, in part this was because the first, like, West of Loathing took 2 years of full-time development. There was a bunch of pre-production stuff, but we more or less spent the first year making the prologue and then the second year making the entire rest of the game. And partly that was because the prologue, as we tried to develop the content for it, that would teach us what engine features we needed and what kinds of things, what sort of interactions that we needed the player character to be able to have with stuff in the world, and like, what does combat mean? What does it look like when you walk up to a thing in the world and get an interaction prompt with it? And partly because we were also showing the game early and often, and we just spent a lot of time iterating on the basics of how play worked in the prologue so that we would know, all right, it's okay to make a whole bunch more of this now because we have like a good basic idea of like, all right, this feels good. This is a thing that people actually get into when they play it. It's a thing that they enjoy walking around in. Like, it feels good to interact with stuff. And yeah, that was like basically the first half of development time was just that first 5% of the game.
Yeah, I feel like there was an overall design doc and sort of a sense of what the world was going to be, and sort of a sense of like an idea of scope. But then we sort of stepped back from that with that in mind, and then just made and iterated on that first hour of game to just make sure that that was really compelling and good. But and the other things that we did, which I think I mentioned in the article that you referenced, was that like we tried to make sure that you would make a decision, and then we would try to make it clear to you that based on the decision that you made, some things were now available and some things were locked out. And so the idea is, if you're going to see everything in the game, you're going to have to play through it multiple times because you're going to make choices that are going to exclude some content. And just trying to introduce those concepts in sort of a passive way, so that players who are curious and actually paying attention will notice that they are not able to do everything all at once, but hopefully alleviate some of that like fear of missing out that you might have if you are trying to maximize your characters.
Yeah, we took a little bit of a risk, I think, by not allowing explicit saving and loading, because it's a thing that I feel like people can get grouchy about, but when games do it right, it's pretty satisfying to not have to spend a bunch of time thinking about that. And so I really wanted to, if we could get away with it, have it be more like an MMO, like more like the model of thought that we were accustomed to for Kingdom of Loathing, where, no, you do this stuff and that's just what happened to you, and maybe the die roll came out wrong and you got this thing instead of this thing, but like, whatever, that's the story, that's what happened to this character, and like, next time it'll be different, and as opposed to just like, we didn't want to put people in a position where it seemed like what we were asking them to do was constantly quick load and open this chest again until they got the thing they wanted out of the chest, because that just kind of, it's a thing that I describe as like, it's at that point like you're not playing the game, you're sort of like playing the box that the game came in. Like it really bothers me when I discover in a game that there is some trivial advantage to be gained by exploiting the save system, because there's a part of me that just says, you're dumb if you don't do this. Like, your character's gonna be stronger if you keep reloading until you get the right thing out of this box. And so we just didn't want to give people that as an option.
Saving the player from themselves is
Yeah.
something that we do a lot. We will, if we find a situation where there's some advantage to be gained by doing this thing which isn't fun, we will either try to make the thing fun or try to cut that whole system, because players will do whatever you like give them, like whatever sort of dumb thing you will do that you'll put in front of them, they will play that in the hopes that it will make them better characters. If it's a character-based thing, it'll make a stronger character or whatever.
He and I have different thresholds,
Yeah.
I think, as players of what we'll do in that regard. And so that ends up, we had a bunch of arguments is too strong of a word. Like, we've all been working together for too long to ever get into any serious fights anymore. We sort of all got all that out of our systems when we were younger. But there are places in West of Loathing where you can just, like, click on a thing and fight a skeleton, and then click on it again and fight another skeleton, click on it again and fight another skeleton. And you get to the point where you can do that, and there's no chance that you're going to lose the fight, and it ends up being advantageous to just keep doing that as long as you want to keep getting XP. And like, there was a lot of internal debate as to whether we should leave those things in or not. I personally felt like I don't mind as a player doing a little bit of grinding in an RPG if it's like, you know, I can just do some work instead of being clever about this problem. Like if I can just spend a few minutes doing something repeatedly so that I can eke out the one more stat point that I need to you know, overcome this challenge somewhere else in the world, I appreciate the opportunity to do that. Whereas Kevin, I think, once he sees that, he is just going to keep hitting that button until everything is 99999 and never move on and ruin his experience. And so we had to kind of figure out, well, what are we trying to please players like me, or are we trying to prevent agony in players like him? And what we eventually did was we just implemented a system where the more fights in a row that you win in a given region, the slightly harder the monsters get. So it actually, like, you can't just do that forever. Like, you will eventually lose.
The mean ones exploits.
Yeah. I guess, I mean, it's not really. You probably still can kind of do
Yeah,
it
'cause
forever. It
that
caps
caps
out
out.
at a certain point, yeah.
The compromise that we came up with instead was those areas get capped if you're using the hard mode. So if you inflicted upon yourself the desire to play the game in a sort of a harder way, it will prevent you from using at least the early sort of infinite fight regions, because those are just too easy to get to and access. And then we actually got some notes from players that were like, oh, is this a bug that these later infinite fight regions don't have that cap? And I was like, well, we actually left those in there because we had not had enough playtesting of the hard mode, because it didn't really get finalized until the last couple of weeks of development, that we did not want to create a situation where you were basically locked out of the in-game content because there was not enough things to do in the world to gather enough experience, so you might have just reached a hard cap. And so we sort of left some of that stuff in. And we've gotten people have written back with feedback that they were super grateful to be able to sort of farm experience at their leisure, right? So like there's definitely a group of people for whom that is desirable. And finding out what your players want is also really valuable. And sometimes you don't know. We had hundreds of people play the game and give us feedback at various conventions. We showed the game at PAX a bunch. We would watch people play and get feedback from them, and even after that, we still didn't know all the things that we finally found out just by actually releasing the game and hearing feedback from the players.
Partly because our demo was only the first hour of the game, where all of the fights were things that were very explicitly designed to introduce a single mechanic, or there's in the sort of area with the snakes in the tutorial, we balanced all of the numbers so that you just can't win the third fight in there without using any skill. You can use any skill that you have with any class, but the only thing is you will lose if all you're doing is just hitting the attack button over and over again. But if you do anything, you will win the fight. But the rest of the game was approachable in any order and got so much less playtesting because it was only the internal beta testers who saw that, and even then we just didn't give them enough time, because this was a software project, we were scrambling around until the last second getting stuff into it, and so there was only so much testing that it was ever going to get. So yeah, I mean, have we made any balance changes after release?
Not fundamentally.
So yeah, I guess we did okay. Or at least people are not loud about things that they think are bad about it.
I think it helps that the game it really sells itself as a comedy game, and so it's about the jokes, and the fact that there's a role-playing game that's somewhat compelling on top of that is great, but that's definitely not the focus of it. So knowing what your game is and making sure that people have the right expectations helps a lot.
Letting it be what it is and getting out of its way.
Yeah.
Not, I don't know. If there had been anybody on the team that was no, this game has to be Dark Souls hard, or it's just not going to be true to my vision of what it is, we would have had to have stopped that person from making the combat too hard, because that is not what the average person playing this game is going to want.
I have a couple questions. The first one is, do you guys meet every business day to work, or do you guys work at home mostly and collaborate remotely? How do you work as a team on these types of projects?
We are spread out all over the place. Kevin and I are both in the Bay Area, and we actually have an office that we go to during the time when we were really seriously working on the game, 4 days a week, probably. It's one of the advantages of this team having been together for so long is that we all more or less have an idea of what our responsibilities are, and Slack is just hugely important in getting stuff organized.
An asynchronous chat tool.
And we use Trello just as like a sort of task list, and that's kind of another like sort of important thing. There is a central place where everything that anyone expects of anybody else is listed, and then we do weekly. For a while, we were doing twice a week conference calls, and that is a thing that, like, no matter how good your intentions are, you are always going to work the hardest the morning before a conference call where you have to describe your progress to the rest of the team. And so a lot of stuff just got done in big bursts right before people were directly held accountable for it by having to talk to the rest of the team about it. So it's just, we're a lot more sort of chill about that than a lot of companies are, and that has been a real detriment at previous points in the company's history. But I think at this point, the sad thing is, eventually maybe you let go of the people who aren't super self-directed and who don't really fit with the style that everybody else is okay getting stuff done in, and that sucks. But in the end, you end up with the right team for the style that you have if it's going to work. We were definitely putting in significantly more than 40-hour weeks for a while at the end, but it was kind of different hours for everybody and different amounts for everybody. It all sort of depended on, because I don't think just a flat structure where everyone has to be in an office from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. 5 days a week works for anybody, really. I don't think that there's anyone who is optimized to work in that way. And so often, I would be in the office at 7 in the morning and go home at 3 and then pop back on a few hours later to do a couple more hours of stuff. Kevin would be there all night. Everybody else, wherever they were, I don't know when Riff did most of his work, but he got it all done, so it kind of didn't matter, right? He knew what he needed to do on the writing side. There was a pile of work. We all had a basic idea of how much time we had left, and we all just kind of.
Having team is contractors, and so we are not even legally allowed to tell them when to work, which I think, and that's an important distinction. If you're not an employee, the person you're working for cannot legally tell you when to work, and so don't let them if you're doing contract work. It's all project based, basically. Because if they're telling you when to show up to an office or something like that, then you're an employee. Even if they're not giving you benefits and that kind of thing, they're never.
That is technically true, although.
I know a lot of people. I know that doesn't happen. I know that isn't how a lot of corporations are run. But those are the legal definitions, and we kind of try to stick to that to a great degree. Our conference calls are the only thing that we really specify at a time and a place that everybody has to be sort of present, and the rest of the time it's all very asynchronous. Get your stuff done when you can, according to your own schedule. And that's the fact that we all just work on the internet from across the U.S. in different cities is great.
And I think it worked for us in large part because we were all pretty happy. Everybody was making enough money to be okay with things. Nobody felt like they were being exploited. There was enough good stuff about the job, and everybody believed in the project enough that everybody was really giving their all. And I don't think we could have scaled that up to 20. There were 7 of us, and it's great for 7 people. We didn't really have to have a management layer. We all just kind of collectively kept each other honest about everything. But man, I can't even imagine what it would have been like if we had twice or even 3 times the team size. Personally, I don't think any of us are interested in growing the company at all. Like, we were able to make this thing with the number of people that we have, and it would be awesome to make another one with the exact same people, maybe working slightly less hard because our processes are better now. That seems really ideal. So, there's something else?
Yeah, so you were talking about the grinding aspect, and so how do you keep your game from becoming, an operant conditioning chamber or a Skinner box, and still manage to make something that you feel is fun, and how do you balance that kind of with the purchasable items and things like that?
Oh, for Kingdom of Loathing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was kind of a collective question, but yeah, in that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
So Zach's degree is in psychology.
Okay.
we, one of the things about the community of Kingdom of Loathing is we have always been very available to them, and very honest about our thought processes and honest about our practices. And I think that is the only thing. We have been extremely reliant on the continued sort of loyalty and generosity and respect of the people that are giving us money for the stuff that we're putting out. And there has never been a time when we have really had to think about trying to maximize revenue. So we've been lucky in that regard, where the primary driving factor on the way that we monetize that free-to-play MMO is try to maintain the respect of the people who've given us money in the past, so that they will continue to feel that we deserve it in the future, as opposed to try to get as many new people in as possible that we can trick into giving us as much money as possible before they say, screw this, and leave. And so I think, like, having gotten started before this sort of, like, broader trends in exploitative free-to-play stuff really took off, allowed us to kind of, like, not be that, because we were able to use what we saw everybody else doing and think, hey, let's not do that, instead of seeing, Zynga making a bunch of money and saying, hey, we should also do that.
We've been accused many times of being a lifestyle company where we're not interested in maximizing profits, we're just interested in making enough money to be happy. And it was, at the time, it was used sort of as an epithet, like, oh, you're not trying to, like, grow your company to the point where you can sell it, who cares what you're doing? And we were like, well, we're sort of maintaining our lifestyles and very happy, so what's wrong with that? And like
that seems to come from my point of view. That attitude comes from a perspective of somebody who has never done a job that they liked or cared about, right? Like, I mean, because our exit strategy is not sell the company. Our exit strategy is like, well, I hope we can keep making video games until we die. Yeah, and like that's fine. Like, it would be awesome if this company like allows us to keep doing that.
Finish whatever we're working and then
Sure.
die shortly afterwards.
Or at least like hire some younger people eventually.
Sure. So we don't sell loot boxes, which has been sort of a recent discussion. When we sell something in Kingdom of Loathing, it's a discrete thing that does something, and you get a sense.
It's typically not consumable. Like,
Yeah.
we will sell like a little factory that produces consumables that you can then trade in the player economy, but we don't typically sell consumables. There are a handful of very limited exceptions to that, but not anything of real import.
And then KOL in the sort of Skinner box, since fighting monsters that have rare drops, let's say, Kingdom of Loathing has a finite amount of time that you can play it per day. You can potentially like work around that by having multiple characters or whatever, but the idea is you can do this for a while, but then we're locking you out. So like that is another way in which I feel like we're being sort of morally responsible about the Skinner box kind of approach.
And we don't ever sell more energy. We don't sell, and like that was just a very early decision. Like, all right, we're just not going to do that because that, if we stick to that, that stops us from accidentally doing some exploitative garbage, maybe. And so it's
And then West of Loathing, there really aren't monsters or loot boxes or whatever that are effectively Skinner boxes. Like you fight something, and if there is something that's rare that it drops, it always drops.
Yeah, or like there are some things that are like, you know, if you open enough medicine cabinets, like it just keeps track of how many you've done, and at a certain point, it just gives you, hey, here's like an exciting one-off thing that would be in a medicine cabinet or whatever. Like we sort of just fake
a lot of
fake a lot of randomness so that it's delivered in a way that's satisfying. As opposed to, like in a multiplayer game, I think it's not a big deal to have rare things drop in the world because that then creates value and scarcity in the player economy. You know, so it's sort of the difference in like a World of Warcraft sense, the difference between like a cool piece of gear that drops from a raid boss and a cool piece of gear that drops 1 out of every 10,000 times you kill a random goblin at level 3 out in the world. That seems awesome to me. Like the fact that like, oh, maybe you get one of those and you're really, really excited about it because you either get to use a cool thing that not very many people have, or you can sell it to somebody else for enough gold to buy 10 things that are that powerful, just less rare. But there's no point in doing that in a single player game. And so we just don't.
We tried, I feel like we tried at least to be very respectful of the player's time in West of Loathing. In Kingdom of Loathing, we, I think, have that same kind of goal, and it's just a little harder because it is a little grindier in that sort of way. Kingdom of Loathing was always meant to be, at least sort of in our head, sort of a coffee break game. It was not meant to be a thing that you would play for 6 or 8 hours at a stretch. It was meant to be you play it for half an hour a day or something. And it's definitely grown beyond that. There are definitely people who spend a lot of time playing it. But that was not the original intent.
Sorry,
Yeah,
give me another question.
Yeah.
Do you keep metrics on, well, because you said it's grown beyond that, so do you actually keep track?
We're extremely bad at metrics. We collect a lot of data, and we theoretically could use that to sort of learn some things and do some data mining, but we just generally don't.
I mean, we try to listen to what people say in forums and in the chat, and like if we like get a sense that like, well, the prevailing sentiment is that this thing isn't fun, then we think, all right, well, what can we tweak to make it more fun? You know,
Yeah, feedback is definitely trumping for us, at least, the actual just numerical stuff. Yeah, we collect the data, but then don't look at it in a lot of ways.
Also, as an MMO, I mean, a lot of just the state of the game is itself the data that you could use as metrics, right? I mean, we do some, like the logging stuff that we do in West of Loathing is mostly just kind of for our own edification. Like, we have a sense of like, all right, of the people who've created characters, like how many of them did a non-violent solution to this boss, how many of them did a violent solution to this boss, how many of them solved this one particular really hard puzzle or whatever, just so that we can have a sense, like, in the next game, if we're making this, like, are we making this for 4 people, or are we making this for most of the people that play the game, which will maybe inform, like, how important it is to us, or, you know, how much effort we're going to put into it, or how important to the overall arc of the game we want it to be.
But the people who made characters, how many of them are playing a game that they bought? How many of them are playing a game that they pirated?
Yeah.
You know, stuff like that. Yeah, like, there are definitely companies that are using metrics to maximize profits. I don't know of a lot of companies that are using metrics to maximize fun, and that's what we are primarily interested in.
And we've been extremely fortunate to be able to do that. It's like,
To make enough money to
you know,
be happy ourselves.
right. It's hard to be like, we don't want to get up on too much of a high horse about the ethics of what we've done because we could afford the horse to begin with, which is we didn't have to worry about it because we were already fine, which is a position that, you know, not a lot of people are. And it's, you know, I think even getting West of Loathing off the ground, and West of Loathing ended up being like, in terms of sales, like 3 times as good as we needed it to be to sort of keep operating as a company. We had our expectations set pretty low, just because the marketplace is very, very crowded, and it's very difficult to get any attention on a new game that comes out when it's like 150 new games a day launch on Steam. We were very fortunate to have had something that was 15 years old that a lot of people knew about, able to get a little bit of a critical mass of people buying it on day one, and then we also listened to people. We were initially going to sell the game for $20, and we were counseled by a lot of different people, don't do that. Sell it for $10 because
It doesn't look like anything.
yeah, it doesn't look like anything. And if a game is on the Steam top sellers list and it's $10, 20,000 people will buy it. And if it's on there and it's $20, 0 people will buy it. Because a thing that doesn't look like anything, that if you haven't like specifically had somebody tell you about it, like people are, people don't want to waste money on garbage video games. And so like give them the opportunity to try it by wasting slightly less money if it's bad. Which sucks. I mean, we're working on porting the game to iOS, and it's like, well, people on iOS won't even spend $10 on a game, so what do we do there? Like, we could either convert it into some kind of weird hybrid free-to-play thing, or we can just like sell it for $4 or $5 or whatever. And that sucks because you don't want to work really hard on something for 2 years and then think, oh, this isn't worth $10. I'm okay with that, I guess. But it's the realities of the marketplace, and you can't stomp your feet and change the way economics work.
You can try.
You're just gonna be static.
I actually had a question that kind of piggybacks off of your conversation, or you're talking about the marketplace. You guys started back in 2003. If you were to start today, in today's market, do you feel like there would be any major changes or considerations that you would take?
I don't think launching the same game that I launched in 2003 would amount to anything if it happened now. I think that I got real lucky by having something that was differentiated from anything. I mean, like Kingdom of Loathing came out slightly before RuneScape, slightly before World of Warcraft. Like, there were not really any other web MMOs with any amount of content in them that you could play.
And at that time, people at their desks were screwing around on a web browser. They weren't looking at their phones because people didn't have smartphones.
Yeah.
Right, like they didn't have Facebook. So like there was a lot less competition for your time. We didn't move into a mobile space put the game on Facebook very quickly, and I feel like we probably would have seen a lot more sort of user growth if we had, but we were happy just living in the niche that we were in. If we were to do it today, we would have to come at it with those kinds of considerations in mind. Like, the vast majority of people who play games are playing games on a cell phone. So you kind of have to, if you are trying to make a game that's going to reach the most number of people, you're going to make a game that's based on that platform. Right?
But you can't sell it for any money, so
Right. That's the other issue.
It's hard to have any meaningful advice just because we are the product of the extremely weird set of circumstances that allowed, that led to us being able to do what we've done at all. And so it's, yeah, I despair about how many games, I mean, even people we know that have made successful and popular games have launched fairly inexpensive games on Steam, got a lot of press, had a lot of attention coming in, but then just don't sell because there's too much there. It's becoming a thing where, what would be awesome is if the government was interested in funding the arts, and stuff could get made without having to think about how to be profitable. Like, that's what would be really cool, and
There's
that's
a
the
bunch
way
of
a lot of art works.
Cool Canadian games that are clearly just funded by the government that I've played that are this would never fly just as a standalone project, but because they had some government backing, they were able to make this thing which is interesting and weird.
Well, and I mean, the other thing is the market is not going to correct itself because there are always people who are going to be passionate about making things and will make them for free, and one person pouring their life, one person remortgaging their house and pouring all of their savings into making a game and it fails, that guy's not gonna make another game, but somebody else will, you know, and so you're not ever gonna stop the flood, because it's just a very like passion-driven thing. It's, you know, people who make games are artists, and so look at how artists are seen in the world. They're, you know, the adjective that is most commonly associated with them is starving, and
Yeah, West of Loathing is gonna be huge after that.
Yeah, man, I wish I had a less depressing point of view on that. But,
Have you given any thought to West of Loathing VR?
somebody, there's apparently some kind of wrapper that you can run like arbitrary executables in that will put it into a Vive, and somebody had tweeted at us that they had gotten it working, and they sent a set of instructions on how to do it. So we have a Vive at the office, but the instructions were too intimidating, and so I haven't gotten around to trying it out yet.
And Will Smith, who does the Foo Show, I don't know if he was at tested.com, we talked with him a little bit about the idea of doing a show inside West of Loathing, but I think we talked to him about a year ago with the expectation that this would be like the 20th episode, where it would be kind of funny to do an episode inside a game that wasn't really PD. But
yeah, and since then there have been 0 new episodes of the Food Show. So one of the first things that you would notice if you went into West of Loathing in VR, like it wouldn't surprise you that everything was 2-dimensional, but everything is tilted back 15 degrees. So that would be a weird thing, because it just made it look better if we had the normal 3D diorama with the camera pointed at it, but then there was a little too much like whatever the opposite of foreshortening is, where the tops of things were slightly closer to the camera. So we ended up just tilting everything back to be parallel to the plane of the camera, and it just like, okay, this just looks like what you expect it to look like now. And there were a lot of just weird decisions like that ended up being made. Like the distances that different things were from the camera were way more about like how convincing does that make the parallax work? Because it's all real, like I mean real parallax in that it is just a camera moving through a 3D space where all the stuff is. But it's, you know, if you actually look at it, there's just like a 2-dimensional set of mountains in the back, and then some trees slightly closer, and then like the back wall, and then a few things in like a really narrow strip of ground. So it's yeah, it would need some work to work in VR. I think you would probably want to just make everything face the player, so it would end up looking like Doom or Marathon, where all of the stuff was just like a sprite that was always facing the camera. Except I think that would get pretty weird, like because you'd walk around behind a building and you would still be in front of it, so it's like.
Getting sideways with the buildings and everything is just rotating.
Yeah.
That wouldn't break the story though at all.
No, I mean, you know, I mean that's the thing. Like we can do whatever in this game as long as we like sort of make fun of ourselves about it a little bit.
Yeah.
That's on brand.
So also, you were mentioning that there are challenges, obviously, with the mobile space, because people are, you know, when you originally launched Kingdom of Loathing, people didn't have mobile phones and they were, you know, using the screen. A lot of mobile phone games that I know people are playing are like clicker or idle games. Do you see clicking of loathing being a thing?
I have always been much more interested in making a phone game than taking a game that I made to be played on a computer and putting it on a phone. This is another thing that we actually do get into real arguments about. I don't think that Kingdom of Loathing works real well on a phone because there's just too much on the screen and the screen is too small. But yeah, I could imagine like taking some of the art and some of the writing that we have and just making it into something that was actually more of a coffee break thing and just launching that. I mean,
it kind of seems like the natural conclusion of where you started.
Yeah, I mean, because it kind of, you know, clicker games weren't really a thing, but it is what KOL looks like. And kind of is. I mean, it's real complicated. It has more story than most of those things do. But yeah, no, I mean, I certainly don't think that there's anything like less interesting or less real about games like that, and it's like, that'd be a thing that would be fun to work on.
The paperclips, universal paperclip.
Yeah.
Is really cool. That just recently came out. That's a Frank Lance's sort of homage to the clicker genre, but also an interesting clicker game, but also a commentary on AI and what it means to have sort of unfettered AI and
What did you say it was called?
universal paperclips.
Yeah, universal paper clips.
Yeah.
It's good. It's like a few hours long.
Yeah. It has the same sort of, not quite as fanciful, but like unfolding complexity that like Candy Box had. So
It's real good.
He knows about Candy Box.
yeah.
I do know.
Okay, so I did want to ask, where do some of the ideas for some of the locations happen? Because I think for like a spoiler warning right now, we're going to talk about everything before the second pitfall, road
Sure.
Okay.
road pit, whatever. Like for instance, Ghostwood I thought was like an interesting place and just funny and tedious, but like where did some of those ideas come from?
So we ended up with a lot of things where, like, we had a big meeting very early on where I sort of like drew the map and I was like, all right, this is what I think the world of this game looks like. There should
Strangely
be
like the American Southwest.
there should be 8 mines in the game. So here. There should be 7 ranches here. And then it was like, we'll come up with something for the 8th mine to be. And then like 2 months from release, it's like, man, why didn't I say 7 mines? It would have been way easier to not have to figure out what this thing was. But often what we would do if we had something that just no one had a good idea for, we were like, all right, there's got to be a ghost town. Like it's the Wild West. There's got to be a ghost town. Like what's this gonna be? Like whatever. Like the dumbest joke that we made in the conference call where we were trying to figure out what it was gonna be is what we would end up going with, because that's what people want out of these games. Is like, you know, okay, what if it's just the ghost of a town instead of a town that's abandoned and full of ghosts? And then like it can just be like, it's like a totally normal town that's just ghosts of buildings populated by ghosts of like accountants and bureaucrats and stuff. And like, all right, now this is a thing that is just Riff's job to write an elaborate bureaucracy puzzle, which is like, that's up his alley. And it was like, all right, well, that's done. That's what that area is.
And he just sort of decided that on his own, because he also did the Shaggy Dog Cave. Like he really enjoys like trolling the player, I guess, is a little bit, like just enough to like raise your hackles, but enough where you're still sort of in on the joke.
I mean, and it's a little too much for some people, certainly. Like, but, you know, we made that a part of a thing where it's like, you have to do a certain number of quests in this town to like move on, and that's only one of them. So you don't have to do that one on a second playthrough.
You don't have to do any of them.
Yeah, there's other ways to get past that phase too. So that was something, like that was kind of an important guiding principle that we had, was that the main quest should be pretty nominal, and that there should be a lot of different ways to get through any given phase of it. Because I feel like in a like Bethesda open world RPG, which was very much the kind of game that we wanted to make here, the main quest is by far the dumbest and least interesting thing about those games. Like in Skyrim, you literally go to heaven as part of the main quest. Like you like, okay, this is the just Nord version of heaven. I'm just literally in Valhalla now and just fight some guys up here and then go like. You just like this just recontextualized everything about this world, and no one has mentioned it or cares that you just went to heaven and came back. Like, and it's like that's not what people remember about playing Skyrim. People remember, ooh, what's in that cave? I bet it's a vampire or something. And then it is, and then you go to the next thing. Like, and that's it. Like, it's just these small little stories about stuff that happened while you weren't there. Like stories where you're not the protagonist are the stories that are the most interesting ones to me. And like, we kind of didn't want to make a game where it's like, all right, well, there's a thieves guild and you can become like the chairman of the Thieves Guild, and then there's also the Warriors Guild, and now you're president of the Warriors Guild, and now you're the best wizard in the world in this political structure of wizards that exists. It's like, no, we want this game to be a bunch of stuff that happens to you rather than like a bunch of stuff where you're the most important person in the world. Because just the structure of the game necessarily creates the illusion that you are the most important person in the world because you're the only actual person in this world on your playthrough. So like I don't, you know, I've never felt like the narrative really needs to back that up. And so yeah, the main quest in West of Loathing is pretty rudimentary, and so it's like, now I don't know. When I first played Oblivion, I didn't really understand. I had never played an Elder Scrolls game before, and I didn't really understand what it was about. So I just went through the main quest line, and 3 hours later, I finished the game. I was like, why do people like these? Like, this was supposed to, like, everybody was really excited about this, and like, that was it. It was like kind of the same thing 5 times in a row, and then it was, hey, you win. But then I realized, oh, okay, the actual game is in these hundreds of other things that you can go out and find, and that's like, all right, that is the feeling that I want to give people with the things that we make.
Well, and so the Bethesda games were a touchstone for us, but also things like the old Quest for Glory games, the Sierra games, originally called Heroes Quest, was something that we thought about a lot. And so that was a game with multiple character classes, and each character class would have different ways to solve the same problem. So the problems would exist out in the world, but there'd be, you could like climb a tree and solve a problem, or you could cast a spell out of the tree, or you could like hit the tree with an axe, and all of those things would solve the same problem depending on which character class you were and which skills you had available. And I feel like that was also a thing that we kind of were shooting for, was play through the game multiple times and then have to solve the same kind of puzzles in new different ways. Other things that were sort of our touchstones were like Paper Mario was a like RPGs with small numbers, but also the wording, like the sort of 2D sprite assets. Were there any other games that we sort of kept referring to and thinking about in development?
Star Control 2 to some
A
extent,
little
although
bit,
it's
yeah.
hard to make a game like Star Control 2 that's not a space game. But definitely that same kind of like, that game had a kind of a sense of whimsy about it, even though it was also occasionally about some like really pretty dark stuff. And that's like, we tried pretty hard to like be goofy enough most of the time to kind of earn the moments where it got grim and slightly less jokey, so that like, I don't know. I think you have to maintain a certain consistency of tone to be able to confidently reject that tone for effect here and there. And that's the thing that I think Star Control 2 did really well. Yeah, I can't think of any others. I mean, I'm sure, you know, I played too many thousands of games for there to not be any other influences, but like really like conscious, like what games were we talking about when we were talking about the design of West of Loathing? It's really that. The Quest for Glory games. And that, I think, thinking about that series so much when we were making this is what kind of turned this game into an adventure game more so than
May I have your attention, please? The arrival of Coastal Republican, less than 15 minutes. Please check out your materials now. At 9 p.m., the library will only be available to SJSU Spartans with current student ID cards. Library hours have now been extended for students for 24 hours. Once again, the arrival of Coastal Republican, less than 15 minutes.
Okay. And we're also not teens, so we've been trained to ignore all of the warnings.
So, when you're talking about like trolling players, I think that's one of the things that I really liked the most in Loathing, the relationship that got set up for it. And I think that my favorite part of that was the English test or the grammar test to use the chat. Who was behind that?
That was me. That was like
Okay.
the first week of the
That-
game. Like when I added the chat, it was.
And that was what actually made me fall in love with
Is that
the game.
satirical, or is that really just saying like,
No.
go through these hoops? Like, because this was before my time, so I don't know.
I don't remember.
I remember that anytime you got into a chat, the people using the language were just really sloppy about it, and this was just like, okay, do you understand the difference between TOO, and TWO? prove it before you can talk to other
Right,
people.
yeah.
That
I
was
don't,
ridiculous.
you know, when I think about it, like, I wouldn't do that now. Like, that very much feels like, that is a thing that was done by a young man who felt very strongly about the way other people ought to be talking on the internet. And it's hard for me to imagine now, like, feeling intensely enough about that to spend the 20 minutes that it took to make that feature at the time. But that's the thing that, like, all of the early press about Kingdom of Loathing latched onto, and I think that it did end up sort of selecting for a community that cared about that kind of stuff, which has probably been really key to our longevity.
Yeah, I feel like there's a large number of players of Kingdom of Loathing who, for years, just used it as a really complicated, bad chat client. And I think that's true of a lot of games that have sort of communities, is that your interest in the actual game sort of wanes, but you've developed friendships, and this is where you hang out with those friends. And so people come around and stick around because that's where they know. It's their third space.
Something that I think falls out of that is a thing that really helps KOL and West of Loathing, I think. West of Loathing, I think, just because more people who are writing about games are paying attention to it now, this feels like a more remarkable feature of it, even though to us it just feels like naturally how we do it. But the fact that the game's narrator is just us writing stuff and trying to be as entertaining as we are trying to be when we write a character in the game, we end up with stuff that people are really surprised that we bother to do, like making the options menu fun. And just making it so no matter where you are delivering any kind of information to the player, you should be using that as an opportunity to entertain them, as opposed to just like, no, this just, you open the box and there's nothing in it. Okay, like, what about a funny version of that sentence that communicates the same amount of information, but also, like, counts as content? Like, and so I think it gives us, like, this density of stuff that people consider to be the material of the game that we wouldn't have if we didn't treat every bit of writing as essentially being in the character of just us talking to the player. They're not, like, the narrator of West of Loathing will like or dislike certain foods depending on how easy it is to make a joke based on liking or disliking that food, not whether, like, me or Riff cares particularly strongly about a particular food. And that's kind of always just been how we've done it. But yeah, I think the grammar test in Kingdom of Loathing was probably an early reflection of that. Like, everything about this is building a relationship between us and the player. And so why would you skimp out on parts of that, Like, make literally every aspect of the thing that you're making. Make sure that your sort of stink is on it. And then if it's a stink that people like, then they're gonna, like, good news, there's a lot of it. Yeah.
So I guess closing question. I'm just gonna turn this question on its head, and then like you guys can like walk around because I'm sure there's a lot of people that want to show you stuff. Okay. Worst thing that you least like about your game, and if it's combat, pick something else. 'Cause we already talked about it. I was gonna say best thing, but I'm like, hey, let's get.
And make it funny.
Yeah.
And talk to us like we're playing.
Yeah.
I feel a little bit like the back third of the game is pretty sparse. It was never supposed to consist of much, just according to the original designs, but then once the whole game actually existed, it was like, oh man, there's really not a lot over there, and it's too late to add very much stuff over there. So I think that, like, we have this sort of problem where, because none of us really, well, I say none of us, I mostly mean me, I'm not real big on like story in video games, and I'm not real big on endings being important in video games. And so what I'll do is I'll create a lot of stuff where I'm like, all right, here we go, we're a third of the way along, we're 2/3 of the way along, all right, somebody else finish this, I'll see you guys later. And then we end up with some kind of weird, like slightly anticlimactic ending thirds of plot lines and stuff. And so yeah, that's the thing I wish I were a little better at.
I feel like the puzzles that are in the game, which is something that I was more responsible for, are variously too hard and also too sparse. I feel like there probably could have been a lot more of them. But I was busy doing other things instead of designing and adding more puzzles than I should have been.
Yeah, we have this kind of weird problem where, like, I don't know that we could get the stuff that we do done faster if we had more people. I think the only thing that we can possibly have is more discipline and more time, and time is obviously an extremely finite resource. Discipline is also pretty finite, so, like, it's, you know, I wish that I could be productive for more hours of the day, and I wish there were more hours in the day. Like, you know, I wish that none of us ever got a cold, so we didn't just like, well, crap, now I'm just not really getting anything done this week. You know, I wish none of us ever got depressed, so it's like, well, maybe instead of working, I'll just play Diablo 3.
Another game when you go to heaven.
There you go, yeah. Yeah, yeah, and the heaven in Skyrim wasn't even, they weren't like sick crucified angels and stuff. Like, it was just like a mead hall. Which is probably better.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that was the whole description of something, right? It was just
Yeah.
Beat up the warriors, like that was it.
Yep.
I guess you're probably the most interesting thing to happen to those guys throughout the entirety of the story. So.
Attention everyone, the library will close to public in less than 5 minutes. Please check out your materials now. After 9 p.m., the library will open the available to adjacent departments with current student records. Library hours have not been accepted. Customers must return us.
There's another announcement in like 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So I'd like to try to end on like a really high note. How many children of Loathing are there? How many kids are there of people who met in Kingdom of Loathing?
I feel like we've met dozens.
Is that the strangest thing that you've ever
It's
encountered?
weird.
in
Yeah,
development?
that's weird. I mean, it is, you
You're
know.
not really responsible, but you're responsible for these people.
Yeah, I mean, I think Kingdom of Loathing occurred at a time on the internet when people, like, it was really novel and interesting and fun for people to like arrange meetups around a shared particular interest on the internet, and we also really supported it a lot. Like, we would go to as many of them as we could, you know, like just because it was fun for us, you know, it was like, wow, this is neat. Like, somebody rented a hotel ballroom to hang out with their friends who like this thing that I made, you know, we should go say hi to them.
Some of those kids are now playing the game.
Yeah, that's true.
That's
They're kind of mystified by it. I think the extent to which that's a real thing is a little overstated. But yeah, that's a little weird. It's a little weird the number of people who got, like, the art in Kingdom of Loathing was like, when I made it, it was just me, so the art was like all I was capable of, right? And it was always pretty compromised. It has definitely developed into a style, and it has become more confident and more deliberate, and like, I don't know, like, you know, the whole Malcolm Gladwell thing, like if you spend 10,000 hours drawing stick figures, like you're gonna get okay at it. Like, it has definitely gotten better over time, but the fact that like there are so many people with tattoos of stuff that I drew when I was like 25, and like, hey, look, the whole joke is that I can't draw.
Now that's on your body.
Yeah, maybe don't do that. That's but yeah, no regrets, right?
No regrets.